2 hours today. We'll have a 5-minute break, and we'll also be back this time tomorrow to cover new material. So I'm sure you all are familiar with Brie and Chris from last time, or you've read their bios, so I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to let them speak for themselves, and you'll learn about them through their presentations. One other note is that we have turned the chat section off. We have noticed that people spend a lot of time and energy chatting in there and asking questions when the speakers have spent a lot of time preparing and thinking about their topic. And we'd like you to just sit back and enjoy that. Absorb it, take notes, think about it, daydream about your garden while they're speaking. And when this presentation is posted live, the comments section will be open then, and we invite you to ask their comments. I will get email alerts every time there's a comment made, and we'll nudge Brie or Chris to answer those for you, and they'll be happy to do it. They did it last time, and very quickly too. So with that, I'm going to leave the floor to Chris. Thank you.
Okay, it's super exciting to be back and talking about seed saving. And I kind of want to begin by, thanking Soil³ for making space to talk about seed saving and just putting seed saving and seed starting together in a way that you don't see very often, but is really, really logical, because if you are saving seeds, then as the season rolls around, you need to start seeds. And if you're starting seeds, I think you should be saving seeds. And so what we're seeing here is the formation of gardening and agriculture as a cyclical thing, which is closer to what we see in nature than as this linear progression from maybe buying some plants in spring and then just being done once they're harvested in fall. So really moving towards more sustainable systems as we embrace seed saving as part of our sustainable food systems. So thank you again, and I'm excited to share this information with you. Also, in terms of the timing, just to put it in context, seed saving isn't happening that much right now. I have some collards going to seed that will be saving soon, but a lot of seed saving is traditionally, towards the end of the season, like post-harvest. But there's a big aspect of the seed saving stuff that we're going to go through today, and hopefully you'll learn about and be able to apply this season, that needs to be thought of now as part of our planning phase in gardening. So as you're planning your garden, you can be thinking about seed saving. So a lot of these skills that we're going to talk through will be applied much later, but thought about right now. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we're going through this program. I'm excited to be here. Okay, so we'll start with a quote to put us in context, because I'm a bit of a fan of seeds. Think of the fierce energy concentrated in an acorn. You bury it in the ground and it explodes into a giant oak. Bury a sheep and nothing happens but decay. So yes, it's a joke, but it speaks to like this miraculous nature of seeds, that we can have great faith in seeds and they will produce something pretty amazing. And I'm not going to talk about saving oak seeds, because that no one's really planting many oak trees at the moment to feed themselves, but the power that is contained in the seed can create the oak tree, and that's what's really special about seeds. So let's dive into it. I always like to start with this kind of like contextual slide, because I think of seed saving as like kind of standing on the shoulders of giants in many ways. We have this huge history, botanical, culinary, cultural histories behind us that have led us to the point where we are now, and the food crops that are currently available. And I think of these people as like our genius ancestors, the botanical wisdom of the past, that if we can relearn to appreciate them, then we can build on that going forward. So it really is a continuum. Seed saving is honoring the past and looking to the future. And one of the crops that shows this the best, certainly in terms of like that genius nature of this botanical ancestry, is Brassica oleracea, which way back when was kind of like a wild, weedy crop. And these genius ancestors looked at that crop and noticed that there were certain parts of that plant that could be developed in certain directions through selective seed saving, which we're going to talk about a little bit. And from that one wild species, they have created all of these food crops that you see below. And so different strains have been taken off in different directions to produce a massive diversity. But it's really just one species. It's all from one kind of like parent-based genetics. And I think that's pretty incredible that people could have the foresight and the time and the investment to do multiple generations to take something that is just a weed into cabbage and Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, all really came from the same mother plant. So keep that in the back of your mind as we're saving seeds and saving heritage, and also looking to the future, because people are still doing this. We still have a huge amount of wild food crops that aren't in everyday cultivation, and so there's a vast amount of potential out there, even though when we walk into a supermarket we're very funneled into a very narrow mindset when it comes to food. In reality, we could have a very expansive, a very diverse food palette if we continue this work of selective seed saving and culinary exploration. So it's definitely an exciting place to be when you're a seed saver. Okay, so we've kind of jumped straight into it, but what does it mean to be a seed saver? We can kind of set a baseline here. And it's not necessarily an easy question. I'm going to set a premise for what we're going to talk about for all the educational stuff going forward. But I definitely want to take a moment to kind of appreciate that seed saving is an act of saving seeds, but it's also, there's stories and there's history and there's culture. And the person that says it best, and I'm just going to read you a quote, is Janice Ray, who wrote this wonderful book called The Seed Underground. And there's so many good stories in here. There's a lot of really rich information about seed saving, but there's also, it's all rooted in stories, and that's a big part of why people are drawn to seed saving, certainly heirloom seed saving. But it's a pretty serious book too, so let me read you this paragraph. Our seeds are disappearing. When seed varieties vanish from the marketplace, they evaporate not only from collective memory, but also from the evolutionary story of the earth. Seeds are more like Bengal tigers than vinyl records, which can simply be remanufactured. Once gone, seeds cannot be resurrected. Goodbye, cool seeds. Goodbye, history of civilization. Goodbye, food. A seed makes itself. A seed doesn't need a geneticist or a hybridist or a publicist or a matchmaker, but it needs help. Sometimes it needs a moth or a wasp or a gust of wind. Sometimes it needs a farm and it needs a farmer. It needs a garden and a gardener. It needs you. And so that's me and that's you as you learn to and engage with seed saving. It's a real important, powerful act. Okay, but I want to keep the majority of this presentation kind of grounded in the practical how-to, but just know that even though it's simple, this is what we do, it's all grounded in a much bigger world of seed ethics, and it's well worth exploring and learning those stories and retelling them as you pass seeds forward. So for the purposes of this practical how-to, the question becomes, what's it mean to be a seed saver? What are we trying to do as seed savers? And this primary aim of seed saving is really just to take a genetically distinct variety from one season, so we could say our Cherokee purple tomato, to the next season. So next season, when I grow those seeds that I saved last year, I want them to be Cherokee purple tomato. I don't want to plant them and play a complete guessing game of what might grow. I mean, that can be fun if you want to go into seed saving 102 and 103 and do seed breeding and plant breeding. But just for a reliable food supply, I want to know that my awesome storage squash is going to be an awesome storage squash. Or I want to know that my delicious tomato is going to be a delicious tomato. I don't want to play with the genetics when I'm just doing basic seed saving. So that premise leads us to this big question. If I want to carry a genetically distinct variety, Cherokee purple tomato, from one year to the next, the question becomes, well, what's going to stop that Cherokee purple tomato being a Cherokee purple tomato next year? Like, what's going to threaten the purity of that seed variety? And the answer actually is very simple. It's pollen from another variety of the same species. That's it. If there's one thing you take away from this, then it's pollen of a variety of the same species will cause cross-pollination. There'll be a mixing of pollen, and that will threaten the purity of my Cherokee purple tomato. So when I plant my seeds next year, if I've had accidental cross-pollination, my Cherokee purple tomato might not be a Cherokee purple tomato, and therefore I might be sad. Okay, so the whole game, a lot of people get fixated on the actual seed harvesting, which is the easiest, simplest part of seed saving. The whole real game that we're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about is this concept of how do we control in our gardens, in our farms, what pollen goes where. If we can control what pollen goes where, then we can be successful seed savers. And that's where we get into the nuance of seed saving. So the term that you'll come across is isolation. We're trying to isolate our flowers so that we can effectively stop cross-pollination. So we're trying to prevent cross-pollination between varieties of the same species. And below you see 4 ways that we can do that. We go by species, by time, by barrier, and by distance. Sorry, distance is the kind of one of the easiest ones. And I put them in this order because the very first one is the easiest, most accessible, and then they get progressively, not necessarily harder, but a little bit more hands-on and involved in what we're trying to do. So we're going to go through some of these. We're going to have some real crop examples so that you can definitely walk away from this presentation confident that you can do this with a couple of the easier beginner crops. And then all of the tools and the techniques can be applied to anything. So we're not going to talk about everything because, you know, whole books have been, like real thick books have been written on seed saving, and they break down all the specificity of all the different crops. This one is one of my favorites. It's called The Seed Garden. And so it can be overwhelming to get caught up in all those, like that encyclopedic knowledge, and we don't need to do that. We just need a handful of tools and techniques that can be applied to everything, and that's what we're going to try and get across in this short time together. Okay, so that very first one, isolate by species, the only thing you need to know to be able to isolate by species is what is a species. So we're kind of like zooming way back to kind of grade school, basic flower botany. But it's also one of the biggest questions I see cropping up in Facebook seed saving groups, or when I used to work at Soil³ and we used to field a lot of seed saving questions. It's, will this cross with this? Will that cross with that? And it's the easiest question to answer. And all you need to know is this. What we have in all of botany is this taxonomic system where every plant species is given a Latin binominal. And that's what you're seeing in the bold there, Beta vulgaris. And I do want to point out that I don't have any educational training in terms of botany or Latin or any of those things. So a lot of the information I'm sharing is learned from other seed savers and from my own experience and from books. That means that I don't really know how to pronounce Latin. And that maybe one time used to bother me, but then I heard somebody say, nobody knows how to speak Latin. It's a dead language. And I don't know if that's true, but it gave me the confidence to say, well, I'm gonna pronounce it however I want to. So don't get caught up in the academic aspect of this. Seed saving has been around for thousands of years, and you don't need to know Latin to be a seed saver. But it does help to be able to recognize what we're looking at. And when we see these two terms together, the first word capitalized, and that's the genus, and then when that capitalized genus comes across with a descriptor, vulgaris, we put those two words together and we get a species. And we have started this whole presentation off by saying when we have varieties of the same species, they will cross. So we have 2 random varieties. All we need to do is look at their Latin name, their Latin binominal, and go, are those 2 species the same? If answer is yes, they will cross. If answer is no, those 2 words are not the same, then they will not cross. I kind of think, I've got a 3-year-old at home, and you know, she likes putting circular blocks in circular holes and square blocks in square holes. She's just matching up the shapes, and that's all we're doing here. That's like the extent of Latin that you need to know. If you can match those 2 words and go, oh, all those letters are the same, those 2 words are the same, therefore they'll cross. They're not the same, therefore they won't cross. That's our Latin lesson for today. And it's as simple as that. So to kind of just drive home why this is so important, I want to give you a couple of examples. We have a whole system of common names, and actually I'm from England, so Your American common names are not always the same as my British common names. They're certainly not the same as either Spanish common names and all the other languages out there. So common names fall down really quickly when it comes to looking at this. What specifically are we talking about? Like American kale is different to Portuguese kale and all these types of different differentiators. And even within America, the common names fail us when it comes to working out what the species is. So this is just a list of some examples. I'm going to kind of, just for time purposes, leave it to you as a little bit of homework to pick up your seed catalog. I brought Soil³ Seeds catalog here. And just look up some of these things. Any seed catalog that's worth its salt is going to list the Latin names. So what we see here is kohlrabi, so that's the common name, and then you probably can't see this, but it says Brassica oleracea, which is that crop that we led with. We led with Brassica oleracea as that one that was bred into all these different ones. So Brassica oleracea is the species for kohlrabi, which means if we look through our catalog, let me find a page. If we look through our catalog and find cabbage, I'll tell you, because it's small for you guys, it also says Brassica oleracea. So we know that from the first slide, and what we now know is that means kohlrabi can share its pollen and cross-pollinate with cabbage. So those two will share pollen, and then if you cross kohlrabi with cabbage, who knows what you'll get next year, but it might not be cabbage or kohlrabi. And that's what we're trying to prevent as seed savers. And so you can go down this list, and what you'll learn is you'll have this heightened aspect of gardening. Like, I feel like as a seed saver, then you become this botanical observer in a way that you're not necessarily a botanical observer just to grow vegetables. Like, growing vegetables has its own challenges, but you can do it without paying that much attention. But to be a seed saver, you start looking at the flowers, and you start looking at the pollination mechanisms, and you start really paying attention on a level that's really fun and interesting, and even children love getting involved with that aspect of gardening. And so we see that beet and Swiss chard turn out to both be Beta vulgaris. They're both the same species. And most people, when they hear that, if they didn't already know, they're like, oh, that makes sense, because Swiss chard greens look just like beet greens, and we know we can eat beet greens like we can eat Swiss chard. And if anyone's ever tried to do this, you can actually dig up a Swiss chard and see that there's a kind of a bulbous root at the bottom. It's not being bred by those genius ancestors to be sweet and delicious and tender. It's fibrous and nasty, and I don't, I've done it for you. I don't recommend trying to eat Swiss chard root, but technically it's edible, and it's from the same base genetics. It's just being bred in those different lines, like we saw with the cabbage and the broccoli and all those things. Collards and cauliflower, Brassica oleracea, collards and kale is an interesting one, because you've got Brassica oleracea for the collards, but then kale starts, we think of kale as one thing, but on the species level, there's multiple kale species. So you can really start digging into it, and like I say, homework, dig through your catalog and start thinking of things by their species and not their common name, and you'll have some fun revelations as you go through that. Okay, so I've got 3 crops that I feel are going to cover most aspects of seed saving, the seed saving that you would need to know to get going, and some of these different isolation distances and techniques. So we're going to start off with tomatoes. I always like to start with tomatoes because I think it's one of the easiest seed saving crops to go with. So if you don't do anything else, then try and save seeds from your tomatoes this year. And like gardening, you don't just go straight into a massive, fully fledged garden and know everything you're doing. This is going to be the same journey with seed saving. Just start with one crop and then pick another one, and then slowly you'll start saving a lot of seeds all over. Okay, so pollination, it always comes to the flower. This is one of the reasons why tomatoes are so easy. We have this term called perfect flower, and in botany that means you have both male and female parts of the flower in a single flower. So it's not separated, it's all together. And that means that pollination can happen all in the same place. So pollen doesn't need to travel anywhere apart from within that one flower. And what we're actually seeing with this big, beautiful tomato flower is the male parts are on the outside, and we can't even really see the female parts. The female parts are right on the inside of that flower. So we call this on a tomato the anther cone, and the anther cone is completely surrounding the stigma of the tomato flower. And so for our purposes as seed savers, it makes our life really, really easy, because it means that the pollen from the male part, the anther cone, is almost guaranteed to fall on the stigma, the female part of the flower. So the chances of pollen from another flower of a different species, so we're in tomatoes, so I've got my Cherokee Purple and my Amish Paste, the chances of pollen from my Amish Paste getting inside the flower of my Cherokee Purple and beating out all the pollen of the Cherokee Purple is so unlikely that there's a very, very, very low chance of cross-pollination with tomatoes. So with tomatoes, you almost don't need to do anything. If you're already growing tomatoes, you are more than likely already doing everything you need to do to produce seed that will be, the term we use is true to type. It's going to become, if I save Cherokee Purple, it will become a Cherokee Purple next year. You don't need to worry about almost anything, which is why tomatoes are so easy to start with. So we've got our flower, we always look at our flower and try and work out what's going on. And with these perfect flowers, we say that they are self-fertile, they are selfers, and they will self-pollinate really easily, and it makes our life as seed savers that much easier. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I want to put like a little clause in there. As we become better botanical observers, as we become this heightened botanical observer, then you can see differences in tomato flowers. So start going out there and looking at your squash flowers and your tomato flowers and looking at everything. And you'll see here, just as I described, an anther cone, and you can't see the stigma at all. It's just all male surrounding female. So this one, no chance of cross-pollination. But when we look at this one, this tomato flower is a little closer to the wild tomatoes. A lot of the potato leaf tomatoes have this characteristic, or some of the real old-timey beefsteak tomatoes. And just here, you can see the stigma sticking out. So it's protruding beyond the anther cone. So the female part is sticking out beyond the male part. And so suddenly that tomato flower has created a situation where it's much more plausible that a bee could go to my Amish paste, pick up some Amish paste pollen, and put it on that Cherokee Purple stigma. And therefore we have a higher chance of cross-pollination with that flower than that flower. It's a small category that we're dealing with. So this is what leads us to the next. We've done isolation by species, where you just, different species, it's very easy. But isolation by distance is like your next easiest thing to achieve, because you're basically just saying, what are the chances of pollination, cross-pollination, and then how far apart do I have to plant my Cherokee Purple and my Amish Paste to basically say there's no chance of that happening. And so with these flowers here, they say it's so unlikely to happen that you can plant within 10 feet of each other. There's very small space, so I can plant my Cherokee Purple here, and just on the other side of the bed, I can plant my Cherokee Purple, and both those will produce these true-to type seeds. So that's 10 feet. And then with the potato flower, beefsteak type heirlooms that have the protruding stigma, and this will be referenced in the seed catalogs, you need 50 feet. So that's like an example of what we're looking for. If you've got one of these promiscuous flowers, the ones that want to share pollen with other people, then you're going to have a little bit more isolation distance. So this whole concept of isolation distances is really useful and is readily referenced in any seed saving resource. So back to that encyclopedic knowledge, you don't have to remember all the isolation distances, but it's referenced in books like The Seed Garden has really good referencing. You can go online and Google isolation distance of corn, okra, peas, and find this number very easily. So don't worry about the details, just know that isolation distance is what you're going for. And even some gardening books now, this is Ira Wallace's vegetable gardening book for North Carolina, she has a seed-saving note for each of the vegetables that she talks about, and you get the very basic information, and it often includes this isolation distance so that you can plan your garden by separating your 2 tomato types or your 2 okra types by a certain distance. So that's the basics of isolation distance. It's really just putting enough distance between your 2 varieties of the same species. Very achievable with tomatoes, less achievable with some other crops that we're going to get onto, and that's why we need some other isolation tools. I just wanted to show the progression here of the flower to the fruit, and then the fruit is what produces the seed. So it's all happening in one season. This is an annual, so tomatoes are very easy, again, in that respect, as a beginner crop. And then we get this fruit formation, and you don't have to have your entire tomato patch be seeds, so you're not really sacrificing much because one fruit produces a huge amount of tomatoes. So generally, I will have my tomato patch and I will eat all my tomatoes, but like the plant that I think is performing the best, or happens to have a tomato that I think tastes the best, or whatever my personal traits are. Maybe I see one that's just a little bit redder or a little bit bigger, or maybe that plant produced tomatoes a little bit earlier. Then I just keep an eye on that throughout the season. I'm the botanical observer, and I go, oh, well, that plant's producing really good tomatoes. This plant hasn't picked up any diseases yet. This plant was super early, and maybe I'll flag them. Maybe I'll just remember if I've only got a few plants. And as fruit forms on that, if there's multiple people in your garden, it might be worth marking the fruit, so you know that's your seed-saving fruit. And then you just let them go through to maturity, and the seeds in that garden peach tomato will be saved and planted the next year, and we'll have a chance of picking up on these improved traits. And suddenly we're not just seed savers, but we're selective seed savers. We're doing what our genus ancestors did in terms of guiding a variety on track and improving it over time, and having it adapt to our own microclimate or micro-region or just personal preferences. And that's a really exciting part of seed saving that's often underestimated. So tomatoes are as simple as, some of you, if you're a bit further south, may already have tomatoes in the ground. It's unlikely they're going to cross-pollinate, even if you planted them close to each other. You're just going to grow tomatoes like you would every other year. And when you get through to that point where you're harvesting tomatoes, just don't eat every single one. Just save 2 or 3 of them, and there's your seed for the next year. It can be that simple. We'll talk about the actual processing of them at the end, because there's a few tips there, but it's very straightforward. So in terms of other crops that you might want to grow that have a very similar mechanism of pollination, as in they have perfect flowers that are very enclosed and highly unlikely to cross-pollinate, then these all fit into my super beginner category. This year you can start with beans, peas, and lettuce. They're highly unlikely to cross-pollinate. And actually there's a plant breeder who works with lettuce in the Pacific Northwest, Frank Morton, and when you're plant breeding, you're trying to get cross-pollination. And he says with lettuce that he can grow varieties right next to each other. He can smush flowers from 2 different varieties of lettuce together, and he'll still only get 5% cross-pollination. So highly unlikely to cross-pollinate naturally in your field, with just very small isolation distance, and you're good to go. So if you're brand new to this, tomatoes, beans, peas, and lettuce, and that can be the start of your seed-saving adventure. Okay, we're kind of jumping to the other extreme here. You might not want to start with corn. It's got some challenges, but we'll talk it through so you can see some of the other techniques that we're talking about. So again, we always start with the flower, because we're talking about controlling which pollen goes where. We have a very different flower structure here. So instead of that super enclosed, perfect flower that was self-pollinating, what we see with corn, if we even recognize it as a flower, is 2 different flower structures. We have the pollen-producing male flower, which is the tassels up high, and then where the cob forms, we have the silks, which are the female pollen-receiving flower structure. And the cool thing here is that each of those silks is a separate flower, and each silk needs to be pollinated to produce a kernel, which is its own fruit, and happens in our case to also be the seed that we plant the next year. So when we have on the same plant different flower structures for male and female, we call that monoecious. And it means that pollen has to travel from male to female for cross-pollination. So totally different to the perfect flower, pollen does not have to travel. There's different mechanisms here. You're basically down to wind pollination, where the plant is designed to have wind blow pollen and then hopefully land on a female receiving flower structure. Or we have insect pollination, where insects will pick up pollen and then fly somewhere else and drop it off. And that's more of a classic flower that's designed to attract insects. So we can kind of intuit here, even if we didn't know, that these flowers are not designed to attract a whole bunch of pollination activity from insects. And the pollen is designed to be up high and blow around. So we have wind pollination going on with corn. And when we have wind pollination, there's the potential for the pollen to actually travel a long distance. And so we could still do isolation by species, so we could just plant one type of corn in our garden. But knowing that pollen from other corn can travel a long distance, then we may find that we get cross-pollination from neighboring gardens or neighboring fields. So this wind pollination makes things a bit more challenging in terms of ensuring that we have isolation. In terms of numbers, then, there's mixed messages here. Like I think in the cornfields of Iowa, where it's like just open plains and no structures, then some of the commercial seed breeders and creators, seed growers, 5 miles is some of the numbers you see, which is like an insanely large figure. You're not going to achieve that in your home garden. But some other plant breeders will say that pollen from corn is actually quite heavy and doesn't travel that far on the wind, and that if you have some structures and maybe like a woodland or something, then I've seen figures as low as 650 feet. So, 650 feet to 5 miles, somewhere in between, depends how serious you are about that isolation. For the home gardener, I'm usually pretty relaxed. Okay, if I get a little bit of cross-pollination from a neighbor that's around the corner, then I'm not too concerned. That would change if I was being a seed grower for a company where I was like guaranteeing that my Cox's prolific corn was going to continue being Cox's prolific. I like to put this slide in actually as a reminder to myself, to remind you, because at some point, if there was an audience, then I generally get this question. Because somebody kind of panics that they've been planting their squash right next to each other for years and they're worried they've been doing it wrong. So I just want to remind you that we're talking about seed saving. So all these isolation distances and concerns about cross-pollination only really applies when we're talking about seed saving. Most of the fruit production, if this is your tomato, all of that fruit flesh, everything is all maternal tissue. It's all mother plant. And so the cross-pollination comes in from the male. It's just a tiny little bit of the seed that is male genetics, which has a huge effect next year, but in the actual fruit that you're eating, you generally don't need to worry about it. So if you're just vegetable gardening, don't worry. Seed saving is when we worry about cross-pollination. There is another clause here. So what we're seeing here is corn, and we've just said that every single silk leads to a separate kernel. And actually, if you see a cob that's not fully formed with kernels, it's usually a pollination issue. Like some of those silks haven't been pollinated very well, and you don't have that fruit production. So each of these individual fruits. Because the fruit and the seed are so small and together in corn, then sometimes in the first generation, so when you actually see the seed, you can see evidence of a cross. So what we're seeing here is a yellow corn, or rather like I don't actually know what variety this is, but it's going to be one of the colored, Carl's glass gem type corns that is being cross-pollinated by somebody else's yellow corn. And so those yellow genetics are showing up when we see our cob. So that can kind of be a useful indication that cross-pollination has happened. This is kind of moving into seed saving 102, and I wouldn't worry about it too much, but just to see that it is possible in some crops to see a cross in the first generation, but for most things we don't have to worry or think about it for most of what we do. Okay, so I like to use corn as an example of isolation by time. It's hard to just grow one variety of corn because there's so much diversity within corn. I like to have my field corns, my dent corns for making grits or hominy or my own tortillas. But then my daughters love sweet corn, and so I like to have a sweet corn. Popcorn is super fun. So there's lots of different corn to explore. They're all the same species, and they'll all cross-pollinate very easily because of what we've talked about. So you can use this trick where you isolate by time, and that's recognizing that we don't need to have the plants separated by a huge distance. We just need to separate when they're flowering in a temporal timeline. So to kind of make that really obvious with this example in the background, what we're seeing is a real tall, old-timey corn in the front, and then this was a long time ago, she's now 6 years old. That's scary. There's a different corn in the background, and so two different varieties. And if you plant them apart, so I would plant the fastest growing corn first, like as early as possible. You can plant corn, last week of April if it's not too cold, first week of May here. And I'd plant the fastest growing, the fastest maturing corn first, and then I'd wait 2 or 3 weeks to plant the slower maturing corn. And so that pretty much guarantees in like a corn's life cycle of growing, tasseling, silking, pollinating, that the two varieties, even though they're of the same species, will not be flowering, they'll not be producing and receiving pollen in the same time window. And therefore, it's as if I'm planting two totally different things. It doesn't matter as long as they're not flowering at the same time. So corn is one way that we have a long enough season in Western North Carolina to do this isolation by time, and I can save pure seed from two different varieties in the same season as long as I have that little separation in planting time. Another crop that this works really well with is summer squash. It can be really hard to deal with summer squash, and we're going to talk about some other techniques with summer squash, but I definitely like doing it with them because they have this peak window of production. So you can plant one type of summer squash, peak window of production, and just let one of them go old to seed, and you can then plant another one and have a long enough season to grow two different squash at different times and get good seed from both of them. So again, it's all back to the flowering. Think about the flowering. As long as they're not flowering at the same time, you've no chance of cross-pollination. So separation by time is pretty easy, just requires a little bit of planning. Again, similar mechanisms of pollination to corn are spinach, beet, and chard, and that's mainly because they're all wind pollinated. So you have large isolation distances and need to put a different technique in to deal with that, because usually we don't have enough space to deal with that. Okay, so we've done tomato and corn. This is kind of to the middle ground now of where we are with another technique, but there's another special thing about squash that I kind of want to share with you, and that's this. Well, in fact, let me go back one. We've been talking a little bit about the Latin. Usually down here we see Cucurbita spp. If you see that when you're going through your seed catalog, basically it means species plural. So there's more than one species within the genus Cucurbita. And that's something to pay attention to as a seed saver, because we now 100% know that if I plant two varieties that are both described as Cucurbita pepo, they will cross-pollinate. We're trying to stop that happening because we want to save pure seed. And that's like, oh, but I love growing all these different squash. I've got winter squash, I've got summer squash, I've got pumpkins. I love a black zucchini and a yellow summer squash. And it can be a little disheartening to know that I'm telling you, well, it's much easier if you just plant one of those things and you want to plant everything. Within squash, then because of that multiple species, we actually can be really clever with our seed catalog and still have access to a massive diversity of different squash if we select one from each species group. So even though we think of all these as summer squash and winter squash and pumpkins, they can be broken down into multiple species, and then we just pick one from each species, and we can plant 5 different things in one garden right next to each other, and because they're different species, we know they won't cross, and seed saving becomes really, really easy. So that's the cool thing with the summer squash. I mean, with squash in general, sorry. But the downside of that is, and you'll see this when you start exploring your catalogs, let me go back. All of these different species look really exciting and different. A lot of the squash that we like to grow end up being concentrated in 1 or 2 of those species groups. And Cucurbits pepo at the top is probably the best example. So your zucchini, most of your pie pumpkins, some of your winter squash, and all your yellow squash happen to be Cucurbits pepo. So you still might have to apply one of these different techniques to do this isolation program. But the machata has the butternuts, so you can plant a pie pumpkin and a butternut. The maximas are like the hubbards that people like, those real good storage squash that get sweet after about 3 months, so you can plant one of them. This argiosperma is like the kushar. It used to be called mixta. The taxonomists keep their jobs by changing names regularly. So that's a good one. And then this Physifolia, you don't find that in North America very often. It's like a black-seeded melon, which is technically still a squash. So you've got options within there, but you still have to pay attention to what you're planting. So I'm still going to go through this last technique, which is the most hands-on, the most fun in my opinion, because you get to be really interactive with the plant. But we're going to look at isolating the flowers with a physical barrier, and then we become the pollinators. So I'm going to talk you through this. Same as the corn, we're seeing a monoecious plant. So on the squash is the easiest to see this on because it becomes really obvious. You can see the male straight flower on the left, and then on the right we have the ovary forming. So it's really obvious that we've got 2 very different flower forms, and then the female has the ovary, which will become the fruit once it's been pollinated. And then this is just a picture, that female flower on top, the fruit is forming below. So again, squash flowers are very big, they're very obvious. This is the easiest plant to start working with when it comes to working with the flower directly. Again, one more picture just to show how clear the difference are. Some people may have grown squash for a long time and not realize that they had 2 different flower structures. So go out into your garden and start looking at the different flowers and see what's going on. Another common question that comes up is like, my squash plant is producing only male flowers, and there's no fruit formation. You only get fruit formation on the female flowers, and squash plants tend to throw up a whole bunch of male flowers first, so that when the females come along and are receptive to pollen to form a fruit, then there's plenty of pollen available for those fewer female flowers. So that's what you see in there. And then this is it. This is isolation by barrier. And we know, because we've got 2 different flower structures, that we're back to where we were with the corn. The pollen has to somehow get from the male to fertilize the female. That's got to happen. With squash, it's not wind pollinated, it's insect pollinated, and that can be a whole bunch of different insects. And if you look inside a squash flower in summer, it'll be full of lots of different insects, and they're all kind of, you see the bees having a little pollen bath, and then they'll fly somewhere else to have another pollen bath. And if they land on a female flower, then they'll be sharing the male pollen with the female. And that's how we get pollination. If you've got insects, like bees can travel like miles in a foraging trip in a single day. So if you've got multiple varieties of the same species, so your 2 different pepos, for example, your yellow squash and your green zucchini, they can cross-pollinate again, different numbers are put out there in the resources, but like a quarter of a mile, half a mile, up to a mile cross-pollination, depending on your environment. So very readily cross-pollinating, which we don't want, because we want our yellow squash to continue being a yellow squash. So we got this real simple technique where we go out into the garden, and if we can find a flower that has not yet opened, then we know that no insects have got in there to share pollen around. So we go out there during the day, and there's lots of ways to do this. This is a paper bag where we just put a bag over the flower and go, haha, insects, you can't get in here. You can use a little pipe cleaner and just kind of wrap it around the end of the flower so you pinch it shut. I've seen clothes pegs, just putting a clothes peg on the end of the flower. Just some method to stop that flower opening and therefore stopping insects from getting in there. And if you do that on the male and the female before they open, then you then are preventing cross-pollination with a barrier. And it means with these monoecious plants like squash, where pollination still needs to happen for the female to form a fruit and seed, then you become the pollinator, and we do this thing called hand pollination. So this is more of a demo picture. There's a lot of insects in here, which are probably already cross-pollinating. So you would do this early in the morning before the insects are really out, and squash pollination happens early in the morning anyway, so you're kind of working with nature on this one. But if you've managed to close both male and female flowers the day before, then you go out the next day in the morning and you can open up that male one, which is what's between the thumb and forefinger, strip off all the petals, and then you're holding the little male pollen producing flower. Go to your female flower, take off the peg and open that up, and then you're basically just painting the male pollen onto the female, and that is you doing hand pollination. Very, very simple. And that's it. You've pollinated the female flower. You would then close it back up, put a peg or a bag over it again, and that means no other insects will share pollen from another variety while you're not looking. And then hopefully that pollination takes, and you'll have pure seed without having to worry about isolation by distance or isolation by time. So definitely a little bit more hands-on involved, but very effective, very fun to do, and keep an eye. And it's the way to achieve purity with the most confidence. Like, you absolutely know that there's been no chance of cross-pollination because you've controlled the entire process. Similar pollination are the other cucurbits, so melons, cucumbers, pumpkins. Squash have the bigger flowers, so they're easier to work with, but as you learn with squash, you can apply it to all the other flowers, and it's pretty straightforward. I wanted to show you a couple of things before we move on to the final part of seed collecting. There's specialized bags for this, so you can buy different size bags that go over the flower. This is the size I use for okra flowers. I'm going to talk a lot more about okra tomorrow, but I wanted to mention okra briefly. Okra has a perfect flower, so it's both male and female like the tomatoes, but it's also a big, beautiful flower, so you get a lot of insect visitation. So okra can pollinate itself, but is cross-pollinated because of all those insects that visit it. So that means that you can isolate an okra flower by putting the bag over the bud before it opens, but you don't need to do the hand pollination. So you can think of okra as somewhere between squash and tomatoes. It'll self-pollinate within the bag, but you need the bag to stop the insects getting involved. Okay, this is a slide just kind of for completion, and I'm not really going to go through it too much. There's a few things you may come across as you go a little deeper into seed saving that I just feel you need to know for completion. And that's, so it's just a straight information size that you can kind of press pause when you're looking back through this and learn about. But it basically comes down to all the plants that self-pollinate are pretty good with dealing with their own genetics, and you can save seeds from a very small population without any issues. most of the plants that kind of require sharing pollen all over the place, we call them outcrossers. They like sharing pollen, and genetically they need a larger amount of plants to have that sharing of pollen to maintain viability over multiple generations of seed saving. So if you were to save corn from just a small patch of 10 corn plants over years, you would see like a dramatic drop in quality of the corn, and we call that inbreeding depression. Corn is not good at dealing with just a small amount of plants. But tomatoes, you could probably just have 5 tomatoes forever and they'll be totally fine. So just know about that, and if you're dealing with some crops like corn, you might need to think about much bigger population sizes, as much as 50, 100, 200 plants, depending on your references. Okay, so a couple of final notes on things you need to know, and then we'll quickly do seed processing at the end, but we started by saying that that's really the easiest part of all of this. Market maturity and botanical maturity. Market maturity is when you like to eat the crop. Botanical maturity is when the seed is able to grow again. And it turns out that a lot of the vegetables we eat immature. So the market maturity is botanically immature. Here we have an immature baby eating an immature cucumber. And if you want to save seeds from the cucumber, you have to let it go big and gnarly, and it'll turn yellow and bitter, and you definitely wouldn't want to eat it. But the seeds will go hard and will be viable for planting. So sometimes this means that you need to take extra steps to give the plant the ability and time to grow through to full botanical maturity. Cucumber's a good example. Peppers are a great example. Green is just an immature pepper, and they mature through colors, and red is, or its final color is when it's fully mature. So at Soil3 we often got people asking for green pepper seeds, and we had to say, well, every pepper is a green pepper seed when it's immature, and then it matures through to a color. So green pepper seeds would not be viable, red peppers would. Okra is another good example. You see the immature green pod when we'd love to eat it. It matures through to brown when you definitely wouldn't want to eat it, but that's when the seeds are mature. So again, this can be a homework piece to think through which vegetables do we eat that are eaten immature, and what does it look like when it goes through to full maturity, and things can change quite dramatically. Okay, so processing. I've got final 10 minutes to do processing. It's fun, it's hands-on, and I've got a little demo to show you. But it's really quite easy. If we're harvesting that mature seed, botanically mature seed, then we're either going to be harvesting it and it'll be dry and crackly. This is an example. This is my dried okra pod. We just saw the picture. You can kind of hear the seeds rattling. In the picture we've got beans. Again, we've let them go fully botanical mature, and we've got dried crackly pods there. So we're harvesting it dry. The other option is harvesting it wet, which is things like tomatoes and melons and stuff, and we'll do that one next. So if you're harvesting them dry or wet, your end game, like the goal here, is to end up with a clean, dry seed. If it's clean, we're not bringing in any disease vectors through storage, and if it's dry, it will store for a long time. If it's wet, it could mold in storage and all that kind of stuff. So clean and dry, whether it's wet, starts off wet or dry. The good thing with serving a dry seed is it's already dry, so we've skipped one of the steps, and we just need to get it clean. What you're seeing here is a basic winnowing process. So here I've got some roselle seeds that have still got a little bit of chaff. The chaff is the detritus from the pods that are just kind of left over. And I just want the clean seeds. So it can be as simple as the chaff kind of is lighter, so you can blow it out. And this is a little high-sided for this. The smooth sloped edge works really well, or even a plate can work, and you can kind of just bounce and blow, and you can get a lot of that chaff off really easily. The next is, this is kind of more official winnowing. Winnowing is like the blowing of the chaff. You can set up a very simple like window box fan, and what she's doing is pouring the seeds from the top basket into the bottom basket. The seeds, you can see, fall straight down because they're heavier, and if you play around with your fan settings, then the chaff gets blown away. And you can do this with really small seed. I've done this with basil seed, and very light fan setting, but still the seed falls down because it's heavier than the chaff that blows straight off. So winnowing is a really good way to separate the chaff from the seed itself. On a small scale like these beans, like we were doing pounds of beans that day, but on a small scale just for the home use, you can put on your favorite Netflix show and just sit there and hand shell beans, right? And you're just, I hope you can see that, you can just open up the bean pods and you get seeds falling down and the chaff can go somewhere else. So this can be very simple. Okra I often do by hand. I just split open the okra pod, seeds go one way, the chaff goes the other. Sorry. So you don't need to overthink this. You're just trying to get the seed out of the dried fruit as clean as possible. Where it becomes a little more complicated, quickly show you this one. And where's my, sorry. So this is some amaranth. And what we're seeing is a whole bunch of mess, right? Beans, you can just pick out some beans and you're like, I got my bean seed. I'm not going to do that with amaranth because the seed is tiny, tiny, tiny. So one tool you can use are screens, and screens can really speed up your seed saving. Often what you find is you use a mixture of screens and fans to get a really clean seed. On a home scale, you can kind of, mix and match to some extent. You don't need to be too stressed about it. If you're selling seeds as a seed grower, then they like to have the seeds to be really, really clean. So I would just pour all my seeds into the screen. And so I've got different sized holes, and I'm trying to achieve slightly different things. This first step, I just want all the seeds and the smaller chaff to go down, and just to get rid of all this big detritus, right? That's all the mainly just flower head and stuff, which I don't care about. And so you're talking about seconds to get through to a stage where you've got rid of all the big stuff, and then we have different size screens to kind of start breaking it down. So I've got the next one down, and you go all the way through. And the screens I'm using here, there's a few different online options. These ones are actually used for panning for gold, which Soil³ Seed put me onto this year. So this is the first year I've used these. They fit these tubs and the 5-gallon buckets, and so they work really well. These came from Sunny Mountain Prospectors. But you can also buy wooden framed ones specifically for seed saving. These aren't specifically for seed saving, but at the end of the day, it's a wire mesh of different holes to start separating all these things out. So again, I'm getting smaller and smaller. I'm going to do one more for you just so you can see. Hopefully get down to something where we can start seeing the seeds. So this is the next screen size down, and we should start getting rid of all that flower material and all that chaff to get to a point. This is like live action. I hope there's some seeds in there. So now I'm going to pour them into here, and we'll switch cameras and see what we see. So from all that mess and chaff, and in just a few minutes, going real quick, then you can see we've got that really light stuff, which will probably, you could blow that off quite easily. And then hopefully you can see on the camera, if it's clear enough, that we've got all these amaranth seeds at the bottom. So this could be for eating, or it's certainly clean enough for sowing. And just from that, I've got thousands of amaranth seeds. So this speaks to the abundance of seed saving. From just a few plants, we've got thousands and thousands of seeds from a packet that probably cost a couple of dollars, and now I can share and plant more. Okay, so that's the dry processing. Wet processing is just as easy, but what you need to do is get rid of that kind of like sliminess of the seeds. So we do this very simple process of fermentation. So this is a tomato. You just scoop out the goop and put it in a jar. And then you can top up with water if you need to. That's probably a bit too much water. But what it does is it ferments very quickly. So we're talking 24 to 48 hours. If it's warm enough, you get this white scum on top. And this is just breaking down this like gelatinous placental layer around the seed, which is designed to inhibit germination. And if you were just to store it, it would go all goopy and moldy and nasty. You're just breaking it down with this very quick fermentation, which sounds intimidating, but is really easy. Jar, water, 24 to 48 hours. And at that point, you can just rinse it off, and you go from a slimy tomato seed to like a real kind of rough tomato seed. So then you wash off all that top layer of gunk and all the stuff that's fermented and rinse it a couple of times in a sieve, and you end up with something that you'd see in a seed packet instead of that stuff that you see when you're having a tomato salad. So the fermentation stage is just as simple as that. Jar, maybe a little bit of water if it's not too much natural stuff in the tomato, and just let it go funky for 1 to 2 days, and then rinse clean. And then you're back to a point where you've got a clean seed, but then you need to get a dry seed. So at that point, I like using labeled coffee filters because it kind of just takes out the moisture. You can put it on a drying rack. Don't put it in the oven. The most you'd want to do would maybe run a fan on it. If it's a bigger seed, like a squash seed, you might want to run a fan on it just to make sure they don't mold in the couple of days it takes to dry. But very, very straightforward. So anything that's harvested wet, melons, watermelons, squash, tomato seeds, you would run through a wet process just to get that slimy layer off. And then we're at a point where whether it's dry or wet harvested, we've got clean, dry seed. This is a chart that shows longevity. A little bit arbitrary. Definitely seeds can store way longer than this, but it gives you a little guideline on planning. The more important slide is this one, which is if you want to store seeds for as long as possible, then you want to store them cool, dark, and dry. So that's 100% dry, so no moisture. That's why Soil³ seed keeps them in jars, little silica gel packets, totally sealed, totally dry. Dark is fairly easy to achieve. You can have interior closet, you can have basement, refrigerator, but dark is important. And then the cool one is the one that raises the questions. So keeping things cool, the question is how cool can I freeze my seeds? And the answer is the colder you get them, the longer they will survive. Like the global seed vault on Svalbard is something like -73 Fahrenheit. It's really, 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 really cold. For the home seed saver, I will sometimes refrigerate seeds if they're in a sealed glass jar. I keep them in the basement. I don't generally freeze them because I'm usually using them within a couple of years. If you freeze a seed that's not completely dry, then there's a chance that you could kill the embryo. If there's trace moisture around the embryo and it freezes, then you could kill it. So I don't feel like the reward of being able to store my seeds into the apocalypse is worth the chance of losing all those seeds. So I generally don't freeze seeds, but you can, and a lot of old timers do. So I'll leave that to you, but a stable temperature is probably more important than an absolute cold temperature. So even if you don't have a basement or spare refrigeration space, you could put it in an interior closet. If it's a stable house temperature of 70, as long as the seeds are nice and dry, you're still going to be able to get pretty good longevity out of those seeds. And that's me. That's the Utopian Seed Project, which is my seed project, and myself if you want to follow up. But that's kind of like an overview of seed saving, but there's way more to learn. So think of this as the beginning of a journey, and not everything that you'll ever know about seed saving. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm gonna be getting some of those gold digging pans. And I love the tip on the filters, the coffee filters. I've never heard that before. So come back in 5 minutes. We're gonna take a little break, but we'll be right back. And Greg is gonna start a little ticker so you'll know when we're about to come back. Thank you.
I'm Brie Arthur, and I am super excited to be presenting on vegetable garden prep today. Thank you to Soil³ for organizing this event, though I desperately miss seeing all of you in person. It is really exciting to get to do this with proper technology and not be on Zoom for a few minutes of my life. So today we're going to actually cover 5 tips for a successful harvest season ahead. And we're going to focus on warm season crops today. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Brie, like the cheese, and I've written a few books. I am a professional horticulturalist and generally not well-adjusted plant person. My whole life revolves around growing plants and helping other people to have successful experiences with their hands in the soil. Now, Some of my very basic tips include just simply getting outside and actually growing the plants that you've been dreaming of. Grow what you love to eat. Be practical in the plant selections that you make. Grow wherever you can. No judgment. Front yard, backyard, container. I don't care where you do it, just do it. That's the key here. Make 2021 the best season ever for you and your family to be active outside growing all the plants that you love. And try and get your hands dirty. The advantage of Soil³ is that it's full of microbes and it will actually help your health in addition to your gardening experience when you actually get your hands down into the soil and get a little dirt under your fingernails. Now, step 1 is figuring out where to create your vegetable gardens. And honestly, I'm always amazed at how many people don't actually know which way the sun rises. So go outside, pay attention, see in the morning where the sun is, follow it through the day. Recognize that their sun patterns are going to change seasonally. So you're going to have more sun through the summer season when the sun is higher in the sky. And then as the days wane and we get into winter, you're going to have long shadows. The sun is in the south. So you're going to have to pay attention to recognize your brightest areas in different seasons. And this is just something that when you've lived on a property for a while, you start to recognize the differences. And understanding that will also lead you to successfully managing microclimates. And here in the southeast, we kind of have the extremes where we're just cold enough to make winter gardening somewhat challenging. And then in the summer, the heat can be a problem for certain crops. So understanding your location will lead you to success in understanding how to garden with microclimates. Like specifically in the winter season, I don't want to have to cover all of my heading vegetables, things like cauliflower and cabbage and broccoli, but I want to grow them. So I focus on growing those on the south side of my house near the foundation so that I have, extra warmth from the sun and also the heat retention from the brick that's on my foundation. And that gives me this great heat sink that allows me to kind of zone bend, and I don't have to micromanage the space to the same degree that I would if I was growing those crops on the other side of the house where it's significantly colder because the sun doesn't shine there as much. So, step 1, figure out your sunniest areas on your property and focus on developing those spaces. Now remember, vegetables like full sun. There's a reason that you don't find a lot of farms that are deep in the forest. And that is simple because our food crops need more light than shade on average. So I typically say at least 6 hours, but ideally 8+ hours. There are some food crops that you'll get away with growing in less light, really that 4 to 6 hour window. Primarily there you're looking at leafy greens. Also recognize that your food crops are going to need to be irrigated, particularly in the southeastern climate because we have extremes. We had 30 inches of rain that fell in January and February, and then we haven't had any rain for the past 4 weeks, and everybody's having to turn their irrigation systems on. So recognize that nature doesn't always give us what we need when we need it, and that's your role as a gardener to take charge of that. Now, the adage is if you grow it for the fruit or the root, you're going to need it to be in full sun. If you're growing it for the leaves, shade is all you'll need. Now, that's true to an extent. However, I find that even my leafy greens benefit from more exposure than being deep in shade. However, I have successfully grown a handful of root crops, including radish, in shadier zones. So I don't want you to think that it's not possible for you to garden, but if you live on a property with a lot of large shade trees, you're probably going to be more successful gardening through the winter season when those leaves have fallen. And I'm giving you permission right now. Take the summers off when your property is shady, support your local farmers market, or join a community garden. Full sun is going to lead for the best success for fruiting crops, especially our classic summer veggies like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. Now, plant it where it's convenient to water and harvest. And this is really one of those things that has led me away from the traditional method of growing vegetables in an isolated plot in the farthest corner of my backyard. Because the bottom line is, I don't walk past that far corner in my backyard when I'm walking to my car or going to the mailbox or greeting neighbors. It's not convenient. Here's the deal. Vegetables need you to pay attention to them. You have like 15 minutes between harvesting a zucchini that's the size you want to eat before it turns into a baseball bat and you're dropping it at your neighbor's yard and not ringing the doorbell. And don't tell me I'm the only person who's done that, because I know I'm not. So you've got to put these things where you're actually going to notice them, where you're interacting, where you have easy access to be able to water. You know, growing up, we had raised beds far away from the house. It took like 8 hoses connected to get water out to it. It was so impractical, and by the time things were actually ready to be harvested, we had all lost interest, and all of that effort ended up being for nothing. So learn from my mistakes, plant your veggies in areas where you actually interact, and I guarantee you will have a more successful experience. Now, I can't stress this enough. Food crops have to be watered. They really do. I have tried to grow my food crops without me feeling like I'm out there every single day, and my yields were so low that it really wasn't even worth the effort. So I primarily water by hand, and this is because on January 3rd, 2011, I said the dumbest thing that I've ever said in my life. I was talking with a landscaper who was helping me install the first phase of my garden, and I said, I don't need irrigation, I like dragging hoses. Don't do that. Don't do what Brie did. Every time I drag that hose, I'm reminded of how I had the option to make this more convenient and chose not to. So I highly recommend, that if you have irrigation, you work with your system. Some tips on that though. Drip irrigation is really great for your permanent plantings, things like trees and shrubs and perennials. But drip might not be the most accessible when you're including vegetables in those landscape areas, because your vegetables are going to change each season, which means you're going to have to be adjusting those drip lines on a regular basis. Another thing that I have found, soaker hoses just haven't been worth the effort for me. You have to run them for so long to actually be able to get the soil fully saturated, that I have found it's just easier for me to go around with a hose or even a sprinkler and get the ground watered more quickly. But the real lesson here with regard to watering is the more time and attention you spend on soil improvement, the less dependent you're going to be on needing to supplement the irrigation. Now, I use sprinklers. I know there are a lot of crops that it's not recommended that you do overhead watering, but in the case of my home garden, it's just not going to be possible for me to not run sprinklers, particularly through the months of like July and August when we tend to be really dry. And some of my favorite sprinklers for the home garden use come from Dram. And the reason I like these, they last for a really long time. I don't know about y'all, but I'm tired of buying stuff that breaks within the first year and then I have to buy it again over and over again. I'd rather buy quality and know that I'm going to keep it. I don't like this disposable lifestyle that we have sort of developed recently. So I've had this Dram over here that looks like a sled for like 15 years, and I use it every day. What I really like about it, and maybe this goes to me kind of being a little bit lazy, I can just drag the hose and it goes right along. I don't have to go turn the water off and get soaking wet. I can just drag the hose and move this to all the different areas of my home garden, and it works really well. It has a bunch of different settings. Now, step 2. Start small and do it right. Now, my degree is in landscape design. I am a firm believer in starting with a plan. It's the roadmap that you need. It tells you how much square footage you have, how much soil and mulch are you gonna need, how many plants actually fit in the bed, right? So you can't go wrong having a plan that's drawn to scale. Especially if you're like me, you live in a suburban neighborhood, you might actually have to submit that plan for your homeowner association to give you the approval that you need. So in the case of my garden, I have warm season turf. And I've learned, this is my third garden in North Carolina, I can't lasagna garden with warm season grass, okay? You either kill the grass with an herbicide or you get a sod cutter to remove that grass if you're trying to create a garden bed. But you can't just layer, stuff down on the ground like cardboard and mulch, because at the end of the day, centipede, Bermuda, zoysia grows right up through it, and then you're going to be battling this infestation of turf beds that are in the area that you want to grow, not grass. So start small and do it the right way. Now, if you have the advantage of having cool season turf, especially something like fescue, you can dig that and turn it over. So you have a little more flexibility with how you can develop a garden. But if you have warm season grass, heed my warning. I did this wrong twice. I don't need to do things wrong 3 times to learn my lesson, but sometimes I have to do it wrong at least twice before I totally get it. I'm here to help prevent you from making all the mistakes that I've made over the last 20 years. All of your success in the garden really does start with your soil. And as a Midwest native, this was one of my biggest challenges to overcome. I grew up in southeastern Michigan. I went to college in northwest Indiana. We really didn't have to do anything to fix the soil. We could just dig a hole and everything would grow. And then in the winter, the ground froze and all the topsoil actually stayed in place. And that's the biggest difference between, living in zone 5 and moving down here to zone 7. The ground doesn't freeze consistently and we get a lot of rain through the winter season. So all of that great organic matter that you're adding through the summer gets washed away and ultimately lands in the Atlantic Ocean. So you're never going to be done adding organic matter to your soil. That is just the main habit you will have as a southeastern gardener. If you're a transplant from somewhere else, this will be the main thing that you have, like the hardest concept of being able to wrap your head around. You'll think, but I just bought compost. Why do I need more? You'll always need more compost, okay? It's your number one investment, but it's the fastest way for you to have a successful experience in the garden. Now, why do I love Soil3? Well, I'll tell you, I have bought a lot of bad compost over the years, and to the point where I have entire areas of my garden where I can't grow plants because I brought in soil that had bacterial infections, or I brought in soil that was filled with nutsedge seed, and I will never ever be able to get rid of that nutsedge. And it hurts my feelings to know that I bought those problems, right? So when I found Soil3, I don't know, 8 years ago at a trade show, I basically lost my mind. I put my hands in that soil and I was like, I can't live a happy life until this is the stuff I'm growing in. And I didn't even know at the time how much effort they've put into creating this quality compost. But the reason that this soil is so different from all of the other compost that you buy is that it's actually derived from 3 specific ingredients. So it's 1/3 grass clippings, 1/3 wheat straw, 1/3 cow manure. And these are all put in giant windrows. It's heated to 160 degrees, so there's no weed seeds in there. They actually add mycorrhiza to it, so by the time it lands on your property, it's teeming with life. It's ready for you to plant in. And it's all of this put together that makes this the only soil at all that I use for everything. I use this for raised beds, top dressing my landscape, top dressing my lawn space, all of my containers, and all of my seed starting. Now, the one exception is if you're planting blueberries or other acid-loving plants. And in that case, I recommend mixing soil conditioner with your Soil3. That way you acidify the soil and you give those plants their optimal growing condition. All right, let's talk about organic fertilizers. There are way too many options, okay? Like, if you want to confuse people in the world, give them 50 things to choose from that are all almost the same. So it's really hard when you go to the store to actually make the right decision. So the key thing that you're looking for is going to be a more or less balanced NPK ratio that's going to be under 15. Okay, remember, this is for your vegetable gardening. Vegetables can't really absorb ratios of like 20-20-20. It's too much fertilizer, and a lot of that's going to ultimately run off into water systems and cause problems somewhere else, off your property, but nevertheless in the ecosystem in which you exist in. So I recommend, looking for products that are more like 6-4-5. I usually try to buy fertilizers that are under 10. So understand NPK. Nitrogen is going to promote leafy greens, okay? Phosphorus promotes roots, blooms, and fruit set. And potassium is also going to promote root systems, but it really helps with stem development. So you want to have all three of these macronutrients available so that your plants don't have to really struggle or, try to find these nutrients from your native soil. Now, one of the other reasons that I recommend lower ratios is because I use Soil³, and as a result, I don't have to fertilize as much as I used to. So it's another advantage to using Soil³ as your primary growing medium. Now, I also like to use fish emulsion or really any ocean products. So if you want to be vegan, you can use kelp meal. I use these exclusively through the warm growing season. So usually once a month, April through October. And what I love about these products is that the plants actually absorb them both through their foliar and through their root system. And it really just kind of, I think, compensates for any potential nutrient loss as a result of excessive rainfall or excessive irrigation. I especially focus on fish emulsion in anything that I am growing in containers. Now, step 3, be realistic is what this slide actually should be telling you. If you're a gardener in the Southeast, you are going to deal with animals, disease, insects, and weeds, period. And if someone tells you they don't have those things, they're either not gardening or they're lying to you, okay? So just be realistic. It's okay that we all deal with this. In fact, the more we talk about it, the better we'll be at dealing with all of these realities of being a gardener, because it's not all a perfect Instagram picture. That's the thing. We really should be taking more pictures of the behind the scenes reality so that we can collectively, feel bad for one another. I love it when I show people what my weeds look like and they're like, oh, thank God, I'm not the only one. So, is anything animal proof? No, and stop asking that question because it's stupid. So reality is you have more than just deer. You're always going to be dealing with animals, and let's just be thoughtful for one moment and recognize that we are the ones that have encroached on their properties, not the other way around. So let's really think more critically about how we can grow in a way that we stop being mad at these creatures and start actually enjoying the fact that they're visiting us on a regular basis. So a few products that I recommend, especially for, animals that cause a tremendous amount of damage, like voles. The Vole King bags are a game changer. So if you've got, new plants that you're buying at the garden center, especially things you're making a big investment in, say like a Japanese maple, right? It's grafted, it's big, you're really excited about it. You don't want voles to come and eat the roots so that it flops over in the garden and the money you spent was for nothing. Just buy a Vole King bag. What's awesome is they come in all different sizes, from 1 gallon to 25 gallon. This is the easiest, cheapest way to give yourself an insurance policy against those in-ground mammals that eat plant roots. Now, repellent. What I've found over the years is that repellent is actually only as good as the devoted gardener who actually applies it. So here's the deal. It's really easy to buy repellent and put it in your shed and not actually use it. I've been polling people. It turns out that actually happens far more frequently. The repellent doesn't work when you leave it in its package. You actually do have to put it out in your garden in order for it to operate. So I really have had a lot of success using I Must Garden. I do want to say, I think one of the tricks for repellent is using many different kinds, because that is going to keep the animals sort of surprised. You know, that way they don't get used to anything for too long. What I think is really unique about I Must Garden is that it's formulated differently for every different animal. So it's up to you to figure out who's causing the trouble and then buy and apply the repellent that will actually work for that critter. So like in my case, I have a major mole and vole infestation. My whole neighborhood is infested with them. I use this on a regular basis, usually every 14 to 18 days, and I have driven all of them to my neighbors' yards, which is precisely my goal. If they leave my property alone, everything is fine. I'm the only gardener in my neighborhood. Another thing about spraying repellents is that you have to apply them more often, and especially during the growing season. So I don't want to tell you to disregard the directions on the back, but I do want you to think about this. Repellent is not systemically absorbed. So if you have a plant that you sprayed last week and it's grown 6 inches because it's the spring season, you have to reapply the repellent. Last week's repellent isn't on the new tissue. So in the spring and early summer, when plants are growing really rapidly, you need to apply it more often. Now, my kind of go-to, and this is especially handy in the middle of summer because my plants always need more water, is motion-sensored irrigation. And this is great. You can buy this for $73 on Amazon. So if you're like really in a battle with deer and rabbits and groundhogs, maybe even some squirrels or maybe some neighborhood kids that you don't like hanging out in your yard, get motion-sensored irrigation. Critical component here, it shoots at anything that moves. So if you have people over and you're entertaining, you do need to remember to turn it off for the evening or everyone will get hit with a really high velocity of water. It's shocking. This is so cool because it has day and night detection. So, you know, if you're working all day and you find that, you know, rabbits are coming in and eating all of your vegetables, you can have it set, you know, so that it's active when you're not out there. But this is really great. I recommend hooking this to a hose and not a sprinkler system simply because you need to move it around about every 10 or 14 days. Again, it's the element of surprise that makes this effective. Okay, in the Southeast, you haven't gardened until you have had plants die from a disease. That is the bottom line. We have the exact climate for all the diseases that exist. And especially if you grow tomatoes, you have inevitably experienced at least one of the things that are on here. So, you know, it's important to recognize what disease is. There are a ton of really good online resources, especially through extension services. And you can even send sick plants into the materials lab to get a proper diagnosis. And I've done this a number of times to fully understand, you know, the depth of which some of my bad pre-Soil³ compost purchases have led to. Now, there's a lot of disease control, you know, chemistries that work, and many are organic, including like copper fungicide. Now, this is me confessing to you, just like the idea that, you know, deer repellent doesn't work when you just stash it in your shed and you just have it on hand when you're not using it. So I have every single one of these on a shelf in my shed. They've been there for 10 years and I've never once used any of them. Because when I see a diseased plant in my house, I rip it out. I don't have the patience to try and make it come back to life. It's an opportunity for me just to grow something different, you know, fix some of the cultural problems that I have created inevitably from overplanting and kind of learn from this experience. But there are products that are safe for you to use to be able to combat some of the more common disease issues. Now, what about pests like insects? And I think it's really important that we have a little discussion about the difference between a pest and a pollinator because they have two entirely different functions. And it's fair to say there are a lot of caterpillars that are garden plant pests. No, that is not swallowtail or monarch caterpillars, but it definitely includes cabbage loopers and tomato hornworms, which can absolutely decimate your crops and really make you feel like you were a failure, even though it wasn't really your fault. So one thing I'll say is my cats don't care at all about any of these caterpillars. But BT is really, like, I think the easiest, kindest solution for managing caterpillar infestations. And, you know, this is very practical. It's organic safe, it's food grade safe. And it's just a biological pesticide that essentially the caterpillars eat it. It makes them feel full and they stop eating and then they starve to death and die. So if you ever visit me in the spring, you will see that all of my Brassicaceae plants are absolutely covered in BT. Now you can buy liquid or powder. I prefer powder because I can see where it is, and I'm reminded when I don't see it that I need to reapply it. Now, for some other like soft-bodied insects that are like more common, things like, you know, aphids and mealybugs, you can apply insecticidal soap. And again, this is great. It's super versatile. It's not toxic. You can spray this on food crops. It's really inexpensive, but you can make your own, which I think is really great. So I recommend using pure Castile soap instead of like Dawn dish detergent because Dawn gets too foamy. And then you use either tap or distilled water, depending on your water quality. Generally, if you have well water, you should use distilled water. And then the ratio is just 1 quart of water per 1 tablespoon of soap. But you can make it even more practical by adding, you know, like a teaspoon of garlic or crushed red pepper. That will help repel chewing insects, but also will help repel some of the animals that might be nibbling on plants. In usually late summer, early fall, when powdery mildew gets out of control, you can add a teaspoon of apple cider vinegar, and that will help combat powdery mildew. And I generally recommend adding 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil. That will act as the surfactant to make it stick to the plant longer. Now, weeding. I think hand weeding is the best decision. Frankly, it gives you the opportunity to be up close and personal. I think there's something to be said about spending some time on your hands and knees in the garden. My favorite tool of all time is the groundhog. It's literally an extension of my right hand. I can't function without it, which is actually why I have my name written all over it, because I'm super paranoid that someone will try and steal my groundhog. You can buy this from Amazon. You can have your own groundhog. I promise you, you will not regret it. It is a fantastic tool. It comes in two different types. I like the pick, but there's also the cultivator. If you're trying to prevent weed seeds from germinating, you can actually use corn gluten meal as like an organic pre-emergent. And what's kind of cool about this is it's most effective on crabgrass. So I actually recommend using this in your turf beds. I have a huge crabgrass infestation in my backyard, and so I've started applying this, and it's actually been very successful. But a secondary use of this is that it's actually like 10% nitrogen. Now that's important to know, so when you're applying other fertilizers, you don't like double apply the nitrogen. You want to focus on, again, a balanced ratio of NPK. But this is a pretty cool solution for a problem that most people face with regard to weeds, you know, infesting specific areas of your home landscape. Now, my best advice for weeds is really just to adjust your expectations. That might be the main takeaway for me from pandemic life is like, well, let's just set expectations lower and then we'll never be disappointed, right? So maybe don't have the standard that you'll never have a weed in your yard, and then you won't be aggravated when you do see weeds. It's really all about your perception, right? But my main approach for dealing with weeds is to focus on ground plane coverage. So the easiest way, the safest and least chemical driven way to deal with weeds is to make it so they don't have the opportunity to germinate and establish to begin with. So that means not having a bunch of open mulch space, because that is ideal for weed seeds to get, growing in there, but to focus on direct seeding the plants that you actually want to grow and fill up that open mulch space so that it's going to be a more competitive experience for problem plants to get in and, set their seeds everywhere. So I think this is the most efficient and inexpensive approach, because overall seeds are the cheapest aspect of gardening, especially if you follow Chris's lead and collect your own seeds, then you have the zero cost involved. So compared to, having to add a ton of mulch or having to spray a bunch of herbicides, direct seeding to eliminate weed pressure is going to be the most cost effective and frankly most beautiful approach to managing this realistic problem that we all have. Now that leads us to plant selection, and I can't stress this enough. Don't grow plants that you don't like. No one can make that decision except you, but if you don't like eating tomatoes, don't grow tomatoes. In my house, my husband does not like Swiss chard. Now, I like Swiss chard, but I have learned over the years, I don't need to have 200 square feet devoted to Swiss chard. I can't eat all of that. So, be realistic. Make a list of the things that you have eaten for a week and find 4 or 5 vegetables that recur over and over again that you're comfortable cooking, and focus on growing a bunch of those things so that your experience in the garden actually shakes out to be changing a habit at the grocery store. For me, that is the way that I really feel gratification from the effort that I put into growing plants. When I go to the store and I know I don't need to buy any potatoes because I am growing all the potatoes that I need, that makes me feel like what I have done has meaning. Now, if I was growing one of everything, I would never really have a harvest to be able to say everything in this meal is from my yard, because you'll always be having to supplement. So keep it simple, keep it practical. Grow the things you love to eat, grow those in a meaningful way. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the more practical elements that don't always get utilized by home gardeners. So, first of all, what about crop rotation? So this is a really important thing, particularly in this region where we're often gardening 12 months of the year. So we're engaging that soil constantly. And it's easy as a home gardener to just get into the habit of growing the same things in the same place. And that's what leads to disease pressure, increase of insects, and overall lack of productivity. So it's important that you move your plants around. And this was ultimately what led me to developing foodscaping in my yard, because I needed to move the tomatoes each season. I couldn't keep growing them in the same place. And I had to start utilizing the sunny areas all over my property, not in an isolated vegetable patch. And so a simple rotation usually involves 2 or 3 crops. And, I often will recommend that you incorporate, grains and legumes, and you rotate those. That way you actually are kind of creating a more functional soil system. You're feeding that soil food web. And, you're being able to provide your own nutrients through the plants that you select. And I'm going to talk more about that in tomorrow's presentation. It's something that I'm really excited about, that I think farmers have employed for a long time, but home gardeners haven't always been able to figure out that dynamic. Now, that leads to succession planting, because over the years I've learned a lot, again, about what not to do, and very frequently I will plant all of one thing at one time, right? I think I'm being efficient. But then when it comes to harvest, I have to harvest all of that at once and then figure out a way to be practical in preserving that. Because last year, I harvested 60 heads of broccoli in one day. I couldn't eat 60 heads of broccoli fresh before it would go bad. So I started thinking to myself, I could have just planted those like 1 week apart, and I would have then had a longer duration to be able to harvest. It would have been more practical for my needs. And that's what succession planting is all about. It's thinking more critically about, what is the plant's growing habit and its fruiting habit, and how can you extend that to make it so that you harvest for a longer time. So my warm season direct seed succession guide is here. Now I've given the generic date of May 15th, and for people in, south like in Georgia or, farther south than that, you would be planting earlier. But for me, in the Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7 area, our soil isn't warm enough yet. It's too early for warm season crops to go into the ground. I can't stress this enough. Like, we had frost last night. It's not time for tomatoes yet. The soil needs to be over 65 degrees for any of these warm season annual vegetables to be able to thrive. So I usually say after Mother's Day. Often I wait until like Memorial Day weekend before I really get started on any of these warm season crops. And then I try to do these like twice a month, every 15 days. That way I extend my harvest. And as the plants start to suffer through the heat of the summer, I don't feel bad pulling them out because I know that I have another crop that's coming right behind it so that I will be able to continue harvesting. And I found this is especially useful for squash and zucchini. I have a huge issue with squash and with squash borers, and I'm not gonna spend the time to go out and hand pick them, and I'm not gonna put out pesticide. So my easiest thing is to thumb some seeds in, every other week. That way when the borers get to one crop, I yank those plants out and I have more coming along. But not everything needs to be succession planted. And so you have a lot of things that are going to be, like a leafy green, like basil or lettuce, leaf lettuce, that you're going to be harvesting over a long duration of time from a single plant. So by all means, put those in. Of course, things like tomatoes and tomatillas, eggplants, peppers, those are things that are fruiting bodies. So you're going to be able to harvest from an individual plant. So you can put all of those in. You don't need a succession plant. But what should you plant and when? So I'm going to give you some of my favorite warm season veggies. And, it's just really important to recognize warm season vegetables are the plants that grow in the frost-free months. So these are the vegetables that thrive during the heat. Now, in the southeast, we have a whole different plant palette for growing when temperatures are cooler. And I would recommend, looking at growing your brassica crops, things like Chris was mentioning, kohlrabi and cabbage and Brussels sprouts and broccoli, getting those started later this summer, like in August, so that you can plant in the fall and have fall harvest. But right now, at this stage, we're in late April, we're moving into the season where we're going to be frost-free, hopefully starting today. That's my goal. So here is my warm season guide, and this doesn't include every plant that you would grow, but it gives you a general idea of a seed starting date, a transplanting date. So if you're not going to start it from seed, when you should be buying it from the garden center and planting it, and then a general harvest recommendation time. So let's jump into the plants, because I'm a plant nerd. I love all the different varieties of plants that are out there, and I'm really amazed at how advanced crop science is and what a wonderful era we're living in, where we have the best of both worlds. You can access heirloom varieties and you also have modern genetics. And in the case of basil, I was always a purist, but recently downy mildew has really shaken the world of basil up. And downy mildew is a very challenging disease to be able to conquer. But there are breeders that are working now towards developing varieties that have better mildew resistance. And my favorite's the one that I'm hugging. This is Everleaf Emerald Towers. And what I love about this, it's a very columnar variety, but it's also been bred not to initiate flowers. So last year, I didn't see this bloom until October. That's day length triggered. So I wasn't having to go out and, take all the flowers off all summer long like I would normally do with, say, a Genovese type basil. Not only that, didn't get downy mildew. I was really relieved to have at least one basil variety that didn't succumb to that by the middle of summer, making it inedible, but also potentially spreading those spores to other plants in my garden. Now, Chris mentioned corn. I'm a gigantic grain enthusiast. That's what tomorrow my program is all about. And as a Midwestern native, like I really took for granted the corn that we grew in Michigan and Indiana. But I do grow a lot of corn even here in North Carolina, and I can say that I'm a strong believer in succession planting my fresh eating corn, because that enables me to have harvest not just, like at one time. I'm able to harvest usually June through September. Some of my favorites, I love Breeder's Choice and candy corn. Silver Queen, I don't think there's a person in America, at least, that hasn't eaten Silver Queen corn at some point. That's usually the variety you find at like street side, corn vendors. Two varieties that I really love, also not only because they're beautiful, but I like grinding my own grits. I like Glass Gem. Bloody Butcher is really my very favorite for grits, and I think that actually is a long heritage, is sort of the Virginia choice for grinding, and the grits are hominy. Some eggplant varieties that I've had a lot of success with. This is Hansel, Gretel, and Calliope. And the reason that I've landed on these is because they're smaller fruits. And so I actually harvest them at the right moment. I'm notorious for letting my eggplants get really big and then they're real rubbery and they're not ideal for cooking. I will warn you, eggplants are really capable. Like, you'll get a lot of fruit from a single plant. The year that I was photographing the Foodscape Revolution, I planted 85 eggplants because they're really pretty. And it's the cover of the book is an eggplant mixed in with flowers. And I had so many eggplants that my local food bank told me to stop bringing them to them. So be warned, you don't need, to have like too many of these just for normal eggplant consumption. I can't wait for Chris's talk tomorrow. Even though I'm a northern transplant, I feel like I'm a southerner because I'm obsessed with okra. And I eat okra any way that okra is served. I have never met an okra I didn't like. Some of the varieties that I've been really impressed with, a newer cultivar called Candle Fire. This is just kind of a slightly improved genetic profile from the heirloom Burgundy. And I love Star of David. I especially like that for frying okra because it's really big. So when you cut it into slices, they're like chunky. And then I love eating okra like raw, right off of the plant. But you really don't want to do that to the ones that are spiny because it will hurt your tongue. Again, from experience. So I found that Emerald is a really great variety because it's very smooth. That's because I'm literally eating it right off the plant. I'm not even like bringing it inside and washing it, which you probably shouldn't do, but I can't help myself. I just love okra. So now a pepper variety that I recommend is Mad Hatter. So this is one of those situations where, many people don't have, including myself, don't have the capacity to eat hot peppers anymore. Like, it hurts my digestive system. But, you go through a lot of effort to grow a bell pepper and you get like 4 fruit, which is annoying. And, it's this giant plant and you hardly get anything off of it. But, you grow a Carolina Reaper and you have enough to like share with everyone in your county. Well, breeders recognized that issue and took the genes of the hot pepper and just turned them down so you get the flavor of a bell pepper but the productivity of a hot pepper when you grow Mad Hatter. And I could say from experience, I had one plant 2 years ago yielded over 300 fruit. So you don't need to have a giant pepper patch when you grow this particular variety. Now potatoes, this may be my Czech heritage coming out, but I have always grown potatoes. I think started growing potatoes when I was 3 with my grandparents. So I think everyone should grow potatoes, but they're very practical. Now is the perfect time to be planting. The reason they're so practical is because they're in the Solanaceae family and they have poisonous foliage. Now, don't freak out, okay? I know, you say the word poison and everybody loses their mind. It doesn't translocate to all of the other plants around. That's not how that chemistry works, so you don't have to worry. Your animals, like your dog or your cat, they instinctively know not to eat it, as do rabbits and deer and groundhogs. You need to train the children in your life not to go around just randomly eating things from your yard, because there's actually a lot of poisonous plants in the common American landscape, including things like lily of the valley and hydrangeas. So, you know, don't attack potatoes. This is actually an advantage in that their foliage will help deter those animals from coming into your garden and eating everything else. Now, if you're planting them now, you're going to be harvesting midsummer. And this again is a plant that I recommend planting in succession. One of the first times that I gardened with my neighbor Aiden, he wanted to grow French fries. We planted a 60-foot long property border all at once, and then when the heat index was like 110, we went out and harvested 80 pounds of potatoes. And then you have to figure out where to store 80 pounds of potatoes. So you see, the succession planting actually really does lend itself for a multitude of different reasons. Now, you can grow potatoes in containers too. They're really easy. In fact, I highly recommend, if you've never grown potatoes before, just to try it in a pot. Especially, I think grow bags are good because they're lightweight and easy to kind of just like dump out. Also, plant your potatoes in Soil³. If you're gonna fill a grow bag up and grow potatoes, potatoes love Soil³. I sometimes wonder if they didn't make that compost just for potatoes. Like, was your soil scientist into potatoes like I am? Perhaps. Now, the Seminole pumpkin, this was a new one for me last year, and I got the seed because I was whining to the Florida Master Gardeners about squash bugs, and they were like, oh, we have the plant for you, Brie. And they sent me the seed. It completely has changed my life, and I've been eating pumpkins like for the past 6 months because I grew 3 plants. I ended up with 52 fruit, and they have made it through the whole winter. I had them in my spare bedroom, in case you were wondering where a person stores 52 pumpkins. During a pandemic, you put them in the spare bedroom because no one's visiting you. So it's very practical. So what I loved about these is they were heat and humidity tolerant. The insects didn't get to them. They did grow in the most insane way ever. I had pumpkins dangling from the tops of magnolia trees. They grew all the way through my blueberry bushes. It was a really remarkable experience. And 2 other varieties of squash that I've had good success with, unlike the yellow squash or zucchini that get those borers so badly, honeyboat and white scallop have both done really well for me. Now, into tomatoes, I'm a tomato enthusiast. I'm actually down to only 50 varieties this year, and I kind of feel like a poser now, but you know, Baker Creek is one of my favorite resources for tomatoes. And I grow them all, okay? So this is not a discussion on just tomatoes, but my all-time favorite variety is one that I realize has a silly name. That was actually why I bought it. But cream sausage is amazing. It's a game changer in the tomato world, at least as far as I'm concerned. It's always the first tomato that I get to harvest, usually around Father's Day, and it's always the last tomato that I'm harvesting right before Thanksgiving. It's a semi-determinate, so you can use a tomato cage. You can actually grow this in a pot, and it doesn't like overrun everything else. It's just a really well-behaved, practical tomato. And I also love tomatillas. I like making salsa verde, and tomatillas like the main ingredient in that. Remember that tomatillas are day length triggered for fruiting, so you're gonna get more harvest in the later half of summer going into fall. But a little bit about seed starting. So I love propagation, and I like all propagation. Seed, cuttings, grafting, I am like a generalist. We just recycle the plastic trays that we have acquired over the years from plant shopping. Grow your seed in whatever you want to use. No judgment. If you want to fold newspapers, that's awesome. I just have a massive stash of plastic because I'm addicted to plant shopping. And we sow everything directly in Soil³. So we don't mix it with anything. I don't buy any like bagged potting soil anymore. I just use Soil³. My success rate is so high. I really feel like this is the trick to everything that I do in the garden. And our process is simple. You just, fill your container with about like 3/4 of the way full. I put a small divot in, and then I carefully sow the seeds. And this is especially for like heading vegetables and fruiting crops, because there's no advantage to having 10 tomatoes growing in one tiny container. Then you're gonna end up having to thin them out. So I just add a little light layer of media on top once the seed is sown, kind of tap it to get everything settled, water it in, and then I usually put my seeds in a part shade location. I have a small greenhouse with 50% shade cloth, and that's where I get all my seeds started. And then just keep up with watering, and once they germinate, I like to fertilize again with either fish or kelp. Now, when should you start your warm season seeds? Well, you don't need to start your tomatoes in January, okay? That is completely unnecessary, and you're just like making a lot of work for yourself. So I say April through June. Remember, we have a really long summer, so you don't have to rush it. Don't skip spring. Highly recommend not skipping spring. Remember, there's no benefit to getting your warm season vegetables planted too early. If you put tomatoes out in cold soil, they're not gonna grow. In fact, they're gonna sit and sulk, and they have a stronger potential to end up getting early blight infections as a result of you trying to rush the season. So I recommend starting your seeds outside. In part, I live in a small house. I don't have room for grow lights and a whole setup. I don't think that's necessary. I think in the Southeast, where we have like 6 months of frost-free weather, you can start all of this stuff outside and you have less work for yourself. Now, a little bit about seed sowing. Bigger seeds usually need to be covered with more soil. So my generic approach, small, tiny seeds need to be like basically surface sown. In the case of poppies here, they need light to germinate. Don't cover them, don't mulch them, don't walk on it. Now, things like sunflowers or corn, they can be planted. Basically, I do twice the depth of the size of the seed. Now, some things that you as a home gardener really don't need to know, but I want you to have the terminology. Scarification is the breaking of the seed coat. The easiest way to scarify seeds is to put them in a cup with hot tap water and let them soak for 12 hours. Thing is, if you're buying seed, you don't need to do any of this. It's basically already been done for you. Stratification is mimicking a temperature cycle. So this is going to be, again, more for like when I would grow odd trees and shrubs that the seed didn't germinate readily, and you would have to freeze it and thaw it and freeze it and thaw it and mimic an actual climate condition. Vegetables don't typically have that requirement, so you're not going to really have to do much effort on either of these. My best seed sowing advice is when in doubt, direct sow it. That's your easiest approach. Scatter the seeds where you want them to grow and let them germinate there. You eliminate the issues of transplant shock. They develop deeper tap roots, and ultimately they just are overall an easier plant to grow. Now, what should you direct seed versus transplant? Generally, direct seeding are things that can grow in more crowded conditions. So that's things like leafy greens and grains that I'll talk about tomorrow. Things like poppies, larkspur, zinnias, things that, kind of give you that meadow look. Whereas transplants are things that you need to control the spacing on. And it's not that you can't direct seed these, it's that it's really hard to have the self-control when a seed is so small to actually space it far enough apart. So my favorite seed source is this amazing thing called Google, because I can't keep track of what different seed companies have in stock, okay? But I have had great success with all of the companies here. Baker Creek, Southern Exposure, So True, Park Seed, Johnny's, Hancock, Territorial, Botanical Interest, Renee's. We're so lucky to have so many incredible seed sources available through the internet. And I just thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you will tune in again tomorrow. We start at the same time. I wish you the best this growing season. I would love for you to keep in touch. You can visit my website and sign up for my newsletter. And if you would like to send me an email or catch up on my social media, by all means, I am here on my YouTube doing these demonstrations on a daily basis. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I'll get my
Thank you, Brie. I'm definitely going to get one of those pickaxes this year. You've only been talking about them for years, so thanks for the reminder. And we want to remind you that everything has been recorded. It will take a few hours for it to fully upload and process, and at that time the comments will be live and available. You'll be able to see it on should be on the Soil³ YouTube channel. And we will also on Monday be emailing a link to this presentation and the presentations tomorrow, which I want to reiterate are different than today. I had some product placement down here to remind me. Chris will be covering everything okra, and Brie will be covering gardening with grains, or specifically foodscaping with grains. And if I didn't mention, the comments will also be live. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll make sure Brie and Chris see any questions directed towards them. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 11:30. Thank you.